The Alpine Crest Hotel was famous in its heyday, known for its grand ballroom, lavish furnishings, and stunning views of the snow-covered mountains. It closed decades ago after a tragic avalanche buried most of its surrounding access roads. Rumor had it that several guests and staff died in the disaster, but no official records ever surfaced. Growing up in the area, I always heard stories about the abandoned hotel. Kids at school would claim it was haunted, that if you stood outside it on a snowy night, you'd hear the faint strains of music and laughter, like a party that never ended. I never believed the stories until the weekend trip with my friends changed everything. It was January and the first major snowstorm of the season had hit hard. My friends, Tyler and Brooke, had convinced me to hike up to the Alpine Crest for what they called an exploration trip. We were all outdoor enthusiasts, and the prospect of exploring a legendary place was too tempting to resist. We arrived just as the snow began to fall heavily. The winding forest trail leading up to the hotel had been treacherous but manageable with our gear. By the time we saw the silhouette of the Alpine Crest through the trees, dusk was settling, and the air had turned bitterly cold. The hotel loomed above us, an enormous structure cloaked in ice and shadow. Its once elegant facade was crumbling, with ivy creeping up its sides and snow clinging to its shattered windows. "We made it," Tyler said, grinning. His excitement was infectious, but even he couldn't hide the nervous glance he gave the darkened windows. "Creepy," Brooke muttered, shivering. The wind howled as we forced the front door open. The lobby inside was eerily intact, despite years of abandonment. Dust covered everything, but the ornate chandeliers, grand staircase, and faded carpet still held a haunting beauty. It felt like stepping into a forgotten world. "This is amazing," Brooke said, snapping photos. We wandered the lobby, poking into side rooms filled with toppled furniture and debris. I found myself drawn to the ballroom doors. They were massive, carved with intricate patterns of snowy landscapes. "Help me with this," I called to Tyler. It took both of us to push the doors open, revealing the ballroom beyond. My breath caught in my throat. The room was pristine. Gleaming floors reflected the gold and crimson wallpaper, and the chandeliers above glimmered like diamonds. Tables with white tablecloths were perfectly set, as if ready for a grand banquet. But it wasn't the condition of the room that struck me. It was the sound. Faintly I could hear music. The soft strains of a waltz echoed faintly, growing louder with each step forward. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Brooke nodded, her face pale. "This is too weird," Tyler said, his bravado faltering. "It's probably the wind." But the sound wasn't the wind. The music swelled, joined by the distant murmur of voices and laughter. My skin prickled as I turned to the others. "Let's get out of here." As if on cue, the chandeliers dimmed. The waltz stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so oppressive it felt alive. And then the shadows moved. I froze, staring at the far end of the ballroom. Figures began to emerge, forming from the darkness itself. Men and women in elegant gowns and suits, their faces pale and blurry like smudged glass. They glided across the floor, locked in an endless waltz. "What the hell is this?" Brooke whispered, her voice trembling. "Run," I said, grabbing her arm. The figures didn't seem to notice us at first, but as we retreated toward the doors, one of them stopped dancing. Its head turned unnaturally, locking onto us with featureless eyes. It moved fast. Tyler screamed as the figure lunged, its form stretching and twisting like smoke. I yanked the ballroom door shut, slamming the latch into place. "We need to leave," I gasped. But as we turned to run back toward the lobby, the layout of the hotel had changed. The grand staircase was gone, replaced by a corridor that stretched into endless darkness. "This wasn't here before," Tyler said. The hotel groaned, its walls shifting like a living thing. The once silent air was filled with faint whispers, growing louder with each step. "It's like it doesn't want us to leave," Brooke said, her voice breaking. We turned corners blindly, the whispering voices growing deafening. My heart pounded as I felt something cold brush the back of my neck. When I turned, no one was there. At last, we found a staircase. It wasn't the grand one from the lobby. It was narrow, rickety, and spiraled downward like the spine of some monstrous beast. But it was the only way. We descended, our flashlights barely piercing the oppressive dark. The air grew colder the deeper we went, until frost began forming on the walls. Finally, we reached the basement, a cavernous, freezing space filled with broken furniture and old supplies. In the center of the room was a massive mirror. It didn't belong. Unlike the decay surrounding it, the mirror was spotless, its surface unnaturally bright. As we approached, we realized it reflected not just us, but something else. Behind us stood the figures from the ballroom, their warped faces grinning impossibly wide. "Don't look," I shouted, pulling Brooke away. But it was too late. The figures moved faster than I thought possible. They swarmed Tyler, dragging him toward the mirror as his screams echoed through the cavern. "We have to help him!" Brooke cried, but I held her back. The last thing I saw was Tyler's reflection vanishing into the mirror, his face frozen in terror. The surface rippled, and then he was gone. The figures turned toward us. Desperation drove me forward, pulling Brooke with me as we found another door and stumbled into an endless corridor. In the dead of winter, a strange storm blanketed our region. Roads turned treacherous, trapping everyone indoors. My family and I lived by the railroad tracks, and while trains rarely passed in those days, the whistle in the storm's quiet hours was comforting, a reminder of life pushing through the blizzard. But one night I heard a train that I wish had never come. It was late, almost midnight, when I heard the sound. A whistle echoed through the howling wind, louder than it had ever been. Groggily, I pulled on my coat and peered out the window. Through the blinding snow, I saw it. A long, black train gliding noiselessly through the storm. It shimmered like glass under the moonlight, every window glowing faintly. My father joined me, his face pale. "I didn't think trains ran in this weather." "They don't," I said. We watched in silence as the train slowed. The tracks near our house had a small stop long abandoned by passengers. Still, the train came to a halt, steam rising eerily around it. "Something's not right," my father muttered, gripping my shoulder. For minutes, nothing happened. The train stood silent in the snowstorm. Then I saw movement, a shadow stepping off the platform and approaching the house. By the time the figure reached the porch, my father had fetched his hunting rifle. A polite knock echoed through the wooden walls, louder than it should have been. My father gestured for me to stay back as he opened the door. Standing in the storm was a man in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform. His face was gaunt, pale as frost, and his smile never reached his lifeless eyes. "Good evening," the man said in a voice smooth as ice. "Apologies for the late hour, but our train is stranded and we've run low on provisions. Might we trouble you for some assistance?" My father hesitated. Behind the conductor, I saw faint figures shifting in the train's windows, faces staring out, pale and still. "I don't think we can help," my father said, tightening his grip on the rifle. The conductor's smile widened unnaturally. "Oh, but surely you wouldn't leave your neighbors in need. Please come aboard. Meet our passengers." My father slammed the door, locking it. "No," he muttered. "No way." The knocking returned, harder this time, rattling the windows. Shadows pressed against the frosted glass. Their shapes were human but distorted, arms too long, necks bent at impossible angles. "Dad," I whispered, "what's happening?" "Stay upstairs," he said, his voice shaking. I grabbed the old binoculars from the shelf and peered through the curtains. The train looked wrong up close. The cars were pristine, yes, but they shimmered faintly, like reflections on water. And the passengers inside, oh God, their faces. Pale, hollow eyes stared into the darkness. Some pressed their hands against the glass, their mouths wide in silent screams. "They're not people," I said, my breath fogging the glass. The conductor was still at the door, now joined by others. Their pounding grew violent, the wood splintering under the pressure. And then the whistle blew again, a low, mournful sound that vibrated through my bones. My father dropped to his knees, covering his ears as if the noise were unbearable. I turned back to the window in time to see the train flicker. The cars shimmered and rippled, revealing a twisted sight beneath. The passengers weren't passengers. They were corpses, their skeletal forms bound in decayed clothing, their hollow eyes filled with an unnatural light. "We have to go," I screamed, pulling at my father. But it was too late. The door burst open and the freezing air engulfed the room. The conductor stepped inside, his eyes fixed on us. "You can't stay here," he said with a grin. "Everyone has a ticket to ride. Come aboard." My father fired the rifle. The shot echoed, but the conductor didn't flinch. He raised his hand and the air grew heavier, pulling at us like gravity itself. My vision blurred, and I felt myself being dragged toward the train. "Run," my father whispered, pushing me toward the back door. I stumbled into the blizzard, the wind cutting my face as I ran toward the woods. Behind me, I heard my father yelling, his voice drowned out by that mournful whistle. I didn't look back. When I reached the tree line, I turned to see the train pulling away. The house was gone, replaced by the endless white expanse of snow. The conductor stood on the back platform waving at me. His smile was the last thing I saw before the train vanished into the storm. I never found my father. The authorities dismissed my story, calling the disappearance an avalanche. But I know the truth. I still hear that whistle on winter nights, low and haunting, and each time the storm grows worse. I know one day it will come for me too. It began with an ill-fated camping trip. My friends and I had always loved the outdoors, even in the dead of winter. The snow-blanketed wilderness had a serene beauty, and there was something about its silence that felt otherworldly. When Mike suggested we hike up to Raven Ridge for the weekend, I hesitated, but peer pressure won out. Raven Ridge had a dark reputation. A ski resort was supposed to be built there years ago, but the project was abandoned after several disappearances. The ridge was infamous for its sudden whiteouts, snowstorms so intense they could disorient even experienced hikers. Locals said the snow there was cursed, but Mike brushed it off as small-town nonsense. We set out on Friday morning. Mike, Elena, Connor, and me. The first day was uneventful, filled with laughter and the crunch of snow underfoot. By sunset, we'd pitched our tents in a clearing with a perfect view of the ridge. That night, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees like a chorus of wailing voices. I barely slept, but Mike was already making coffee at dawn, energized as ever. "Best way to start the day," he shouted, grinning. By mid-afternoon, we reached the base of the ridge. That's when the snow began. At first, it was beautiful, light flakes floating down in the crisp air. But within minutes, the temperature dropped sharply, and the flakes turned into heavy, blinding waves of snow. The whiteout came so quickly, we could barely see each other. "Everyone stay close," Mike shouted. We huddled together, stumbling forward blindly. The cold cut through my layers and the wind was deafening. Hours seemed to pass in that frozen abyss until we saw it. A cabin, its silhouette barely visible through the snow. Relief washed over us as we staggered toward it. The door creaked open without resistance and we stumbled into the dim interior, shaking off the cold. The cabin was eerily clean. A small wood stove sat in the corner, already burning brightly, though no one appeared to be inside. A round table with 4 chairs stood at the center, and thick, fur-lined blankets were folded neatly on a cot. "Looks like someone left in a hurry," Connor said, closing the door behind him. "Who cares?" Mike replied. "We're not dying in that storm. Let's be grateful." We dried off and warmed ourselves by the fire. The snowstorm outside raged on, but the cabin was surprisingly warm, almost too warm. "I'll take the cot," Mike said, flopping down. That left the rest of us to share the blankets on the floor. Despite the oddness of the situation, exhaustion won out, and we fell into an uneasy sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, shivering. The warmth was gone, replaced by a biting chill. The fire in the stove had gone out, leaving the room in near darkness. As I reached for my flashlight, I heard it, a faint scraping sound like nails on glass. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was coming from the window. "Elena?" I whispered. She stirred beside me. "What is it?" The scraping grew louder. Slowly, I turned the flashlight toward the window. The light hit the frosted glass, revealing a figure outside. It was too tall, its silhouette stretching unnaturally in the snowstorm. Its face was pressed against the glass, its features blurred and shifting as though it wasn't quite solid. Long, claw-like hands scratched at the window, leaving faint streaks behind. Elena screamed, waking the others. Mike shot up, grabbed the fire poker, and moved toward the window. "Who's out there?" he shouted, trying to sound braver than he looked. The figure vanished. We huddled together in the silence that followed, but none of us slept again that night. By morning, the storm had subsided and pale sunlight streamed through the window. We debated leaving immediately, but the snowdrifts were too high to traverse. That's when Connor noticed something, a set of footprints, impossibly large, leading around the cabin. They circled it multiple times before disappearing into the forest. It must have been some kind of animal, Mike said, his voice shaking. No animal makes prints like that, Elena snapped. We decided to stay one more night. The sun was setting again by the time we worked up the courage to leave the cabin to collect more firewood. As we ventured into the trees, we found something that made me want to run back and never return. Another cabin, identical to ours, right down to the crooked shutters and weathered roof. Inside, the same wood stove burned. The same round table and chairs stood perfectly in place. What the hell is this? Elena whispered. Let's go back, I said, pulling on her arm. We returned to our cabin as night fell. The oppressive chill returned as the wind picked up again, and with it came the noises. The scratching on the windows. The creak of floorboards upstairs, even though the cabin had no second story. The whispers outside, muffled by the snow. When I dared to look out the window, I saw them. Dozens of figures, tall and shifting like shadows. They stood motionless, their blank faces staring toward the cabin. They've been waiting, Connor whispered, his voice hollow. For us. Mike tried to light the fire again, but it wouldn't stay lit. We have to get out of here, he muttered, pacing. The whispers grew louder, the walls groaning under their pressure. The door burst open and freezing air flooded the cabin. The figures began moving inside. Mike swung the fire poker, but it went through them like smoke. Run, I screamed. We fled into the night, our flashlights cutting through the snow. The figures followed, gliding soundlessly behind us. I couldn't feel my hands or feet anymore. The cold was overwhelming. We reached the trees, but something strange happened. The path ahead was blocked by snow that hadn't been there before. We turned in circles, but the forest seemed endless, folding in on itself, and then we saw the cabin again. The storm hit harder than the forecast predicted. My friends and I had planned the weekend in the mountains, expecting mild snowfall, not the blizzard that trapped us miles from the nearest road. By the time we reached the lodge, a creaking, isolated building hidden deep in the forest, the snowfall had turned to an icy fury, blotting out the world beyond 10 feet. The lodge was unexpected. We hadn't seen it on any map, and its state suggested abandonment, boarded-up windows, ivy creeping through gaps in the wood. Mike joked that we'd stumbled onto the set of a horror movie. None of us laughed. Inside, the air smelled of rot and old wood. Dust coated every surface, but the fireplace was piled with fresh wood, and strange symbols were carved into the stone mantel. I wanted to leave, but the wind outside screamed like a living thing, and we had no choice. This is cozy in a creepy way, Liz said, lighting a fire. As the flames grew, we unpacked, trying to make the best of it. Liz and I shared a room upstairs while Mike and Derek took the room across the hall. Despite the winds howling, the night passed uneventfully. Until 3 a.m. I woke to the sound of scratching, slow, deliberate, and coming from the window. At first I thought it was a tree branch, but the trees were too far from the building. I edged closer and pulled the curtain aside. My breath caught in my throat. A pale figure stood outside, half obscured by the swirling snow. It was tall and thin, its body skeletal, its face pressed to the glass. Its eyes burned white, and a jagged smile stretched across its face. I stumbled backward, waking Liz, but by the time she came to the window, the figure was gone. She laughed it off, calling it a nightmare. But in the morning, footprints surrounded the lodge. The second night was worse. The scratching returned, but now it came from all around. Windows, walls, even the ceiling. It didn't stop, no matter how much we yelled or banged on the walls. And when the fire sputtered out, the temperature plummeted. Mike and Derek tried to fix the chimney while Liz and I searched for more wood. That's when we found the door. In a hidden corner of the basement behind a collapsed bookshelf, there was a small door carved with symbols like the ones on the fireplace. The handle was ice cold, but I opened it, revealing a cramped tunnel leading downward. "What is this?" Liz whispered. The air grew colder as we descended. The tunnel opened into a cavern lined with bones, human bones, stacked in neat piles. At the center, a frozen figure sat on a stone throne, its lifeless eyes staring directly at us. And then it moved. The fire upstairs died completely, plunging the house into darkness. The scratching turned to pounding as if dozens of fists were hammering against the walls. We ran. To this day, I don't know how we made it out. The lodge seemed smaller as we fled. The doors and halls warped, closing in on us. Somehow we found ourselves outside,